Clara James, a quiet waitress in Ridgefield, Kentucky, lives invisibly, serving coffee and kindness at Billy's Diner. Struggling with bills and a sparse life, she carries her grandfather's war medals and his lessons of honor. One rainy night, she defies her callous boss, Wayne Becker, by feeding a homeless veteran, Eli Turner. Her small act of compassion costs her job, leaving her in the rain with nothing but courage and Eli's dog tag. As whispers of her deed spread, an unexpected force gathers outside the diner, hinting at a reckoning that could change everything. If Clara's story of quiet courage inspired you, join us in celebrating everyday heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to keep these true-hearted tales alive. Your support helps us tell stories of dignity and compassion. Comment below with your own stories of kindness. Let's inspire each other. The harsh words cut through the air like a blade. We don't serve beggars here. The plate slipped from Clara's hands, shattering against the tiled floor of Billy's Diner, sending shards of porcelain and clumps of steaming mashed potatoes skittering in every direction. The sound echoed in the near-empty dining room, a jarring punctuation to the cruelty of the moment. Clara didn't wince at the crash. Her heart thumped hard, not from the mess, but from the sting of injustice. She stepped forward, planting herself like a shield between the trembling old man and the manager's venomous glare. Her faded brown apron, speckled with grease stains from a long shift, seemed too flimsy to protect anyone, yet she stood firm as if its threads could hold back the weight of his shame. Outside, rain battered the diner's windows, a relentless drumbeat that mirrored the tension inside. The handful of customers still nursing their coffees averted their eyes, their silence louder than the storm. Clara's hand trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out a crumpled wad of tips. Meager earnings from a day of pouring coffee and forcing smiles. "Then take it out of this," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. But the manager's face twisted, his patience long gone. "You're done, Clara. Fired. Get out." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the gray clouds, something extraordinary unfolded. 200 soldiers, their uniforms crisp and boots polished, stood in silent formation outside the diner. They weren't there for the lukewarm coffee or the greasy hash browns. They were there for her, for Clara James, a woman who had spent her life fading into the background, unnoticed and uncelebrated. At 32, Clara had mastered the art of being invisible in Ridgefield, Kentucky, a town where hope seemed to peel away as slowly as the paint on the shuttered storefronts. The factory's closure years ago had left the town hollow, its streets lined with faded dreams and rusted dreams. Clara moved through this world like a ghost, filling coffee cups, wiping down sticky counters, and offering quiet smiles that rarely earned a glance in return. Her brown apron, frayed at the edges, was her armor, shielding her from the weight of unnoticed days. Her chestnut hair, always pulled back into a tight ponytail, kept the chaos of her life at bay, as if a neat bun could hold together the fraying edges of her world. She opened Billy's Diner before dawn, the keys jangling in her calloused hands, and locked up long after the last regular had shuffled into the night. No one asked why she worked double shifts, why her eyes carried a quiet weariness. No one asked much of anything about Clara, and she preferred it that way. Her reasons were her own, tucked away in the corners of her heart, tied to a small apartment with a cracked kitchen window, a one-eyed tabby named Smokey, and a shoebox under her bed that held her grandfather's war medals. Henry James had been her anchor, a Korean War veteran with a crooked spine, a sharp tongue, and a heart as warm and yielding as fresh cornbread. When Clara's parents spiraled into a storm of their own making, addiction and abandonment, he stepped in without hesitation, raising her with a steady hand and a treasure trove of stories. He taught her about discipline, about dignity, about doing what was right even when the world turned its back. "Honor's quiet, Clara," he'd say, puffing on his worn pipe, the sweet tobacco scent curling around them like a hug. "It's like sweeping the porch before guests arrive, even if they never come." His voice, gravelly but kind, lingered in her mind long after he passed 3 years ago. At his funeral, Clara hadn't wept openly, not because the grief didn't claw at her, but because she could hear his whisper, "Stand tall, even when you feel small." She buried her pain deep, channeling it into the rhythm of her days, early shifts, late shifts, feeding Smokey, paying rent. It was a fragile balance, one that held until her roommate vanished last month, leaving behind an unpaid half of the lease, an overdue utility bill, and a landlord with no sympathy. Clara's world shrank to a rented room above an auto garage, a space barely better than a storage unit. She hauled a suitcase and a box of essentials, Smokey's food bowl, a few clothes, her grandfather's medals, to her new home. The tabby meowed once, rubbed his scarred face against her calf, and claimed a drawer lined with a faded kitchen towel as his bed. That night, Clara lay on a lumpy mattress, one hand resting on Smokey's warm side, staring at a ceiling stained with watermarks. The single outlet sparked if she plugged in more than one thing at a time. The bathroom faucet wailed like a wounded animal. Her savings, 64.38 pounds, dwindling by the day, felt like a ticking clock. Yet she made a promise to herself, whispered into the dark, she would endure. She always had. Each morning she rose at 5 a.m., pulling on her worn sneakers and walking through the rain to the diner. The cold seeped into her bones, but she smiled at customers who left nickels and dimes as tips, their eyes skimming past her like she was part of the furniture. She carried her grandfather's lessons like a lantern, their glow faint but steady, guiding her through the monotony and the ache. That night in the diner, when the manager's words had sliced through the air, Clara's heart had raced, not with fear, but with a quiet fury. The old man, his coat threadbare and his hands shaking, hadn't deserved the humiliation. She saw her grandfather in his weathered face, in the way he stood tall despite the weight of the world. Paying for his meal with her tips wasn't just kindness. It was defiance, a refusal to let cruelty win. Losing her job stung, but as she stepped out into the rain that night, Clara felt a flicker of resolve. She didn't know about the soldiers, didn't know that her small act of courage had rippled outward, reaching hearts she'd never met. The next morning, as she faced the sea of uniforms outside the diner, her breath caught. For the first time in years, Clara James, the woman who lived in the spaces between conversations, was seen. And in that moment, she stood taller than she ever had, her grandfather's voice echoing in her soul. Especially then, Clara. In the small, weathered town where Clara James lived, folks often described her as quiet, but that word didn't capture the depth of her silence. It wasn't just that she spoke softly or sparingly. It was that she carried herself with a stillness that seemed to absorb the world's chaos without a ripple. She never demanded anything, not a raise, not an apology, not even a moment's consideration. When a clumsy customer spilled scalding coffee on her worn sneakers, she'd just nod, smile faintly, and mop it up without a word. When the diner's cook, red-faced and sweating through his apron, bellowed orders over the sizzle of grease, Clara moved with calm precision, never letting her face betray the sting of his tone. Even when her paycheck came up short again and the manager, with his slick grin, told her to be grateful for the job, she swallowed the injustice like it was just another bitter sip of diner coffee. But what the townsfolk didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that Clara's quiet wasn't empty. It was alive with observation, heavy with the weight of everything she noticed but never spoke aloud. Clara saw the world in sharp detail. She noticed the regulars who lingered too long over their cold eggs, their eyes tracing the same lonely path across the diner's cracked linoleum. She saw the new dishwasher, a wiry kid with shadows under his eyes, wincing as he stacked plates, his sleeves hiding bruises that told stories he'd never share. Most of all, she noticed the ones who slipped in from the rain, their clothes heavy with damp, and their voices barely above a whisper as they asked for a glass of water. They never met her gaze, as if eye contact might cost them something they couldn't afford to lose. Clara's life was a tapestry woven from these small, unseen moments. Acts of kindness she offered without fanfare, burdens she carried without complaint. She'd sneak a spoonful of tuna from the break room's dwindling stash for Smokey, the diner's half-feral cat, who'd curl up in the alley behind the grease traps. That small gesture felt like defiance, a quiet rebellion against a world that took more than it gave. At night, when the diner was locked up and the town sank into silence, Clara would sit on her sagging couch, her grandfather's dog tags clutched in one hand, their cool metal grounding her. In the other, she'd hold Smokey, his fur matted but warm, his purring a faint comfort against the ache in her chest. "We're okay," she'd whisper to him, to herself, to the ghost of her grandfather who'd raised her. "We're still okay." But the truth gnawed at her in those quiet hours. She was tired, not just the kind of tired that came from long shifts on her feet, but a deeper exhaustion, the kind that settled into her soul. It came from pretending everything was fine, from swallowing every slight, from watching the world spin on while she stood still, always on the outside looking in. She didn't dream of miracles or grand escape. All she hoped for was a roof that wouldn't leak the next time a storm rolled through. Then came that rainy Tuesday evening, unremarkable in its stillness, the kind of night where the diner's fluorescent lights buzzed louder than the conversations. The rain fell in slanted sheets, hammering the windows and pooling in the street outside. When the door creaked open, a gust of cold, wet air swept through, rattling the menus and turning every head in the place for a fleeting moment. A man stood in the doorway, drenched and shivering, his presence like a shadow cast across the room. His coat, once a proud military green, hung in tatters, sagging under the weight of the rain. A faded U.S. Army insignia clung to the sleeve, barely holding on, much like the man himself. His beard was gray and unkempt, patches of it missing, as if it had given up trying to cover the weariness etched into his face. His left leg dragged slightly, wrapped in layers of dirty gauze that looked like they'd been reused one too many times. His hands, trembling as he peeled off a sodden knit cap, were rough with calluses, his knuckles scarred and swollen from a life that hadn't been kind. He clutched a small paper bag to his chest, holding it with a tenderness that suggested it was his only treasure. Clara was behind the counter, scrubbing at a ketchup stain that refused to budge, her hands moving on autopilot. She didn't startle at the gust of wind or the man's appearance. Her eyes caught the way he hesitated in the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room, not for a seat, but for something intangible. Maybe permission to simply be there. The other diners, their curiosity sated, turned back to their coffee mugs and glowing phone screens, dismissing him as if he were part of the storm itself. Clara remembered something the previous shift's waitress had said, her voice dripping with judgment. People like that don't want help. They're just looking for attention. Clara had never bought that. To her, people like this man were trying to disappear, to shrink so small the world wouldn't notice them at all. He shuffled to a booth in the far corner, moving with a quiet respect, as if apologizing for taking up space. He didn't sit, just stood beside the table, one hand gripping the back of the booth for support, his body swaying slightly from exhaustion or pain or both. Clara approached, her damp apron clinging to her hips, the towel still in her hand. "Evening," she said, her voice soft but steady, like a warm light cutting through the storm. "Can I get you something warm?" The man didn't meet her eyes at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as if he feared his mere presence might get him tossed out into the rain. When he finally looked up, Clara saw a storm of emotions in his weathered face, pain and pride locked in a silent battle, each fighting to define him. His eyes, though tired, held a spark of something unbroken, something that refused to surrender despite everything. In that moment, Clara didn't see a stranger. She saw her grandfather, the same stubborn resilience, the same quiet dignity that had carried him through wars and losses and years of scraping by. And in that instant, something shifted deep inside her, not in the world around her, but in the way she saw it, in the way she felt her own heart beat against the weight of her unseen burdens. The man's voice was soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the diner as he spoke to Clara. "A cup of hot water, ma'am, if you wouldn't mind," he said, his tone carrying a quiet dignity that made her pause. "And maybe a scrap of bread if you've got any headed for the trash." His words faltered, not out of frailty, but under the heavy burden of having to ask for something so small. Clara felt her heart stutter, a pang of recognition slicing through her. Those words, they weren't new to her. They echoed a story her grandfather used to tell, his voice weathered by time, about a stranger who'd offered him a meal on a rain-soaked night in Busan, 1952. The memory flooded her mind, vivid and warm, like a candle flickering against the cold. She gave the man a single nod, her throat tight. "Let me see what I can do," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. In the kitchen, the fluorescent lights buzz faintly, casting a harsh glow over the chaos of the diner's evening rush. A plate of chicken and dumplings sat abandoned under the heat lamp, a returned order that hadn't even been touched. Clara's hands moved with purpose, her mind racing. She couldn't just give him water and a crust, not when she could do more. She plated the food carefully, piling on extra slices of buttered bread, the kind her grandfather used to say could make a person feel human again. She poured a steaming cup of black coffee, its rich aroma curling into the air, and arranged it all on a tray with a small cloth napkin, a touch of care she hoped he'd notice. Carrying the tray back to the dining area, she moved with deliberate calm, as if this act of kindness were as routine as taking an order. She set the tray down in front of him, her voice gentle but firm. This was sent back just now, still hot. The man's eyes widened, a flicker of shock crossing his weathered face. I can't pay for this, he said quickly, his voice rough with worry, as if he feared she'd snatch the food away. Clara cut him off with a small, warm smile, one that she hoped carried the weight of her intention. It's already paid for, she said, and the coffee's on me. He stared at the tray, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the edge of the table. For a moment, Clara thought he might cry or bolt. His eyes, cloudy with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, locked onto the steaming plate. Then slowly he reached for the coffee mug, his fingers curling around it like it was a lifeline. You remind me of my wife, he murmured, his voice so low it was almost lost in the clatter of the diner. She used to do things like this. Always said everyone deserved a bit of warmth, especially those who've known too much cold. His words hit Clara like a wave, stirring something deep inside her. She blinked rapidly, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. She could feel the weight of his loss, the way it clung to him like damp clothes in a storm. Across the room, Clara caught a glimpse of Wayne Becker, the diner's owner, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His mouth was already twisting, forming the harsh words she knew were coming, words that would cut through the fragile moment like a knife. But Clara didn't care about Wayne's rules. Not right now. Her thoughts were with the man in front of her, a stranger who carried himself with the quiet pride of someone who'd served a country that now seemed to have forgotten him. She watched as he ate, each bite slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring not just the food but the dignity it restored. His fork trembled in his hand, heavy with the weight of exhaustion and gratitude. She noticed the way he sat, spine straight despite the visible pain in his leg, a stiffness that spoke of old injuries and long years. He didn't complain, didn't beg, didn't cast blame. He simply ate, his silence louder than any words could have been. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eye glistening with unshed tears. You just saved a soul tonight, miss, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Might have been broken, but it ain't forgotten. Clara's breath caught again, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. He reached into the tattered inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a rusted military dog tag, its chain frayed and dulled by time. Pressing it into her palm, he closed her fingers around it. Name's Eli Turner, he said, his voice steady now, as if saying his name aloud reclaimed a piece of who he was. If I don't make it through this winter, I want someone to know I was here. Before Clara could respond, he stood, his movements slow but resolute, and walked out into the storm. His silhouette faded into the gray curtain of rain, swallowed by the night as if he'd never been there at all. Clara stood frozen, the dog tag warm in her hand despite the chill seeping through the diner's windows. Her mind churned with thoughts of Eli, his quiet strength, his unspoken pain, the life he'd lived, and the world that had moved on without him. She thought of her own struggles, the rent that loomed like a shadow, the way her cat Smokey's food bowl was running low. The world kept spinning, indifferent as ever, but something inside Clara had shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of having done something that mattered, something that reached beyond the grind of her everyday life. Even if no one else saw it, she felt it, a spark of purpose that warmed her from the inside out. The moment shattered like brittle glass when the front door slammed open, the sounds slicing through the diner's hum. Clara barely had time to turn before Wayne Becker's voice cut through the air, sharp and dripping with disgust. What the hell do you think you're doing? He barked, his broad frame filling the kitchen doorway. His eyes zeroed in on the empty plate at Eli's vacant seat, the faint steam still rising from it like a ghost of the meal. Clara stood taller, her hand instinctively brushing the apron pocket where Eli's dog tag rested, a small anchor against the storm she knew was coming. "He was a veteran, sir," she said, her voice quiet but unshaken. "He asked for hot water and a crust of bread. I gave him food that was going to be thrown out anyway." Her words hung in the air, steady and true, but she could see the fury building in Wayne's eyes, and she braced herself for what would come next. The sharp edge of Wayne's voice sliced through the diner's hum, louder this time, yanking the attention of the few patrons scattered across the worn booths. Heads swiveled briefly, eyes darting toward the counter before skittering away, as if looking too long might tangle them in the mess. "This ain't no charity, Clara," he bellowed, his words heavy with frustration, each one landing like a stone. "I've told you 100 times, if word gets out we're handing out freebies to street folks, this place will turn into a soup kitchen overnight." His face was flushed, veins bulging at his temples, a man clinging to control in a world he feared was slipping. In the corner, a middle-aged couple froze, their spoons hovering over steaming coffee mugs, stirring with a deliberate slowness that screamed discomfort. No one dared meet Clara's gaze. No one uttered a sound. The air grew thick, not with the greasy warmth of frying bacon, but with the weight of unspoken judgment. Clara stood behind the counter, her chest rising and falling as she pulled in a deep breath, steadying herself against the storm of Wayne's anger. Her heart thudded, a quiet rebellion against the humiliation threatening to swallow her. "I paid for the coffee myself, Wayne," she said, her voice soft but firm, laced with a resolve that surprised even her. "You can take it out of my tips. It's no loss to you." She held his stare, her hazel eyes unwavering, though inside she was a tangle of fear and defiance. She'd known Wayne's temper, had seen it flare over late deliveries or a dirty dish left too long, but this felt different, personal, like her small act of kindness had somehow wounded his pride. Wayne's palm slammed down on the counter, the crack echoing like a gunshot, making Clara flinch and the couple in the corner jump. "I said no!" he roared, his voice raw with authority, as if her words had dared to challenge the very foundation of his world. "You don't get to make me look weak in front of my customers, Clara. You don't get to decide how I run my diner." His eyes burned with a mix of rage and something deeper. Maybe fear, maybe shame, but it was buried under layers of stubborn pride. Then came the blow that stole the air from the room. "You're fired. Right now. Pack your stuff and get out." His finger jabbed toward the door, sharp and unyielding, like a blade aimed at her heart. The diner seemed to shrink, the warmth of the overhead lights dimming as a chill settled over the room. It wasn't the rain hammering the windows outside that made it cold, but the absence of humanity inside. No one spoke up. No one offered a word of support. No one even glanced her way with a flicker of sympathy. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the knot of her apron, her fingers fumbling with the familiar fabric. She wasn't shocked, not deep down. Wayne's temper had always been a ticking bomb, and she'd known her quiet defiance might light the fuse. But the disappointment, that cut deeper than his words. It was the silence that stung most. The way the customers, people she'd served coffee and smiles to for months, sat mute, complicit in their avoidance. The woman in the corner leaned toward her husband, her voice a low hiss. "That's what you get for stirring up trouble," she muttered, her words dripping with smug satisfaction, as if Clara's kindness was a crime that deserved punishment. Another patron cleared their throat, shifted in their seat, and buried their face in a menu, pretending the world hadn't just cracked open in front of them. Clara untied her apron, folding it with care despite the tremor in her hands, and placed it on the counter. Her spine stayed straight, a lesson from her grandfather echoing in her mind. Never let them see you break. She grabbed her bag, her throat tight, and stepped toward the door. The rain greeted her like a slap, soaking her canvas sneakers in seconds, the cold water seeping through to her toes. Her dark hair plastered against her forehead, strands clinging to her cheeks, but she didn't hunch or hurry. She stood under the diner's awning, her arms wrapped around her bag, her heart pounding so loud she could feel it in her ears. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford when survival demanded her focus. A faint rustling broke through the rain's rhythm, pulling her attention to the alley beside the diner. From the shadows, the veteran emerged, his limp more pronounced in the wet chill. His coat was threadbare, soaked through, but his eyes held a quiet fire, a spark of something unbroken despite the years in the streets. His breath came in shallow rasps, but he moved toward her with purpose, as if drawn by a debt he couldn't ignore. "I saw what happened in there," he said, his voice rough but steady, each word heavy with regret. "You shouldn't have paid a price for me, kid." His gaze dropped, shame flickering across his weathered face as if he blamed himself for her fall. Clara shook her head, her voice catching. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, her words fierce despite the quiver in them. "No one should go hungry, not when I can do something about it." Her chest ached with the truth of it, with the memory of handing him that coffee, seeing the way his hands had trembled, not from cold but from gratitude. He reached into his coat, his fingers slow and deliberate, and pressed something into her palm. The metal was cool, worn smooth by time. His dog tag. "You saved a broken man today," he said, his voice hoarse, cracking under the weight of emotion. "You reminded me I'm not invisible. That's worth more than you know." Before she could respond, he turned, his silhouette swallowed by the rain, leaving her clutching the tag, her heart a storm of grief and gratitude. That night, Clara sat in her cramped room, the air heavy with the scent of damp clothes and cheap laundry detergent. Smokey, her tabby cat, curled against her hip, purring softly, a small anchor in the chaos of her life. Her soaked clothes hung over a chair, dripping onto the linoleum floor. The only light came from a street lamp outside, its glow slipping through the blinds, casting slanted shadows across the walls. Clara stared at her cracked phone screen, refreshing her bank account with a sinking heart. $42.12. Rent was due in 10 days, and now she had no job, no health insurance, no safety net. The numbers blurred as panic clawed at her chest, but she forced it down, breathing through the fear. She wasn't empty-handed. She had courage, a stubborn spark that refused to die, even when the world seemed determined to snuff it out. In a strange way, that felt like wealth, a quiet, unshakable strength that no one could take from her. She picked up the dog tag, its edges worn but solid in her hand. The etched letters glinted faintly. Turner, Eli J. serial number F472. The rest was faded, nearly unreadable, but she traced the name with her thumb, her mind wandering. Where had he served? What had he seen? What had he lost that left him on the streets of this town? Why did a country he'd fought for, a community he'd come home to, turn its back so easily? The questions swirled, heavy with a sorrow she couldn't name. The next morning, her world tilted again. She hadn't even known someone was filming until the video spread online, a shaky, grainy clip shot from a booth across the diner. It captured her standing tall, her voice steady as she faced Wayne's fury, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to his rage. The internet had taken notice, and with it came a flicker of hope. Strangers' voices rising where the diner's patrons had stayed silent. Clara stood frozen in the cramped kitchen of Billy's diner, her heart pounding as Wayne, her boss, jabbed a meaty finger toward the back door. His voice boomed, harsh and grating, slicing through the hum of the morning rush. "Out, now!" he roared, his face flushed with fury. Shame burned in Clara's chest, a molten weight that made her hands tremble as she untied her apron. She'd only given a slice of pie to Eli Turner, the homeless veteran who lingered outside the diner most evenings, his weathered face etched with quiet dignity. It wasn't stealing, she told herself, but Wayne didn't care. Rules were rules, and she'd broken one. As she slipped out into the alley, the door slamming shut behind her, she felt the sting of betrayal, not just from Wayne, but from the co-workers she'd laughed with over late-night coffee refills. They'd turned their backs, their silence louder than Wayne's shouts. By noon, the news had ripped through Ridgefield like a grass fire in August. Clara's phone buzzed relentlessly, each notification a fresh wound. She opened her social media, hoping for a kind word, but found only venom. "She should have asked first," one comment sneered. "Bet she's been slipping food out the back for months," another accused. "Thief," a third spat, the word cutting deeper than Clara thought possible. Her former coworkers, people she'd covered shifts for, unfriended her one by one, their profiles vanishing from her feed like ghosts. One, a waitress named Tara, sent a private message that felt like a slap. "Always playing the hero, huh? How's that going for you now?" Clara stared at the words, her throat tightening. She'd never thought of herself as a hero, just someone trying to do right by a man who'd been forgotten by everyone else. Eli's dog tag, tucked in her pocket, pressed against her hip, a cold reminder of his service, his sacrifice, and the small kindness she'd tried to offer. Desperate to move forward, Clara spent the afternoon trudging from diner to diner, her resume clutched in sweaty hands. At the first, a greasy spoon called Mabel's. The manager, a wiry man with tired eyes, scanned her application, then paused. "Look, honey," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you seem nice, but we can't afford the attention. Nothing personal." He slid her papers back, his gaze flicking to the door. At the second diner, she didn't even get that far. The hostess, a young woman with a tight ponytail, took one look at her, whispered something to the manager, and handed back her half-finished application with a curt nod toward the exit. By the third, Clara's hope had withered to a fragile thread. The manager there didn't even bother with words, just shook his head and turned away. Rejection clung to her like damp clothes, heavy and inescapable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara wandered downtown, her boots scuffing against the slick pavement. A chill seeped through her coat, and exhaustion weighed on her bones. The dog tag in her pocket felt heavier now, a tangible link to Eli, who'd thanked her for the pie with a quiet nod, his eyes glinting with gratitude. She passed a bus shelter, its flickering light casting shadows on the figure curled beneath a tattered plastic sheet. Eli. His thin frame shivered slightly, one arm draped protectively over his chest, the other clutching a crumpled paper bag. Clara's heart ached. She knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the cold concrete, and placed a small bundle wrapped in newspaper at his side, half a sandwich, all she had left. "Thank you for remembering me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. She stood, tears pricking her eyes, and walked away, unaware of the black military vehicle idling at the corner. Inside, a man in uniform watched her go, his expression unreadable as he reached for his phone. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving Ridgefield scrubbed clean and eerily quiet. Thin puddles shimmered on the streets, reflecting the first golden rays of sunlight that pierced the low clouds. Downtown was still asleep, its storefronts dark, traffic lights blinking yellow in the stillness. The air carried the scent of wet pavement, mingled with something intangible, anticipation, like the town itself was holding its breath. At precisely 6:45 a.m., a low rumble broke the silence, not from engines or footsteps, but from a presence that seemed to command the morning. Black SUVs rolled into the narrow main street, their tires hissing softly against the damp asphalt. They formed a solemn procession, halting in front of Billy's diner. The first to emerge was a man in a crisply pressed U.S. Army uniform, his chest adorned with a constellation of medals that gleamed in the early light. Colonel Matthew Turner stood tall, his shoulders squared as if still bearing the weight of battles long past. His face was stern, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, a mix of pride and grief. He paused outside the diner's door, his gaze sweeping the street, and waited. Behind him, like a choreographed display of honor, soldiers began to appear. They stepped from vehicles and side streets, their boots silent on the pavement. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, rows of them, all in full-dress uniforms, formed a perfect line along the diner's entrance, stretching down the block. Their silence was profound, their stillness a testament to discipline and reverence. No one needed to be told to stop and stare. Cars slowed to a crawl. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Shopkeepers pressed their faces to their windows, their breaths fogging the glass. In a town where nothing ever happened, this was a moment that demanded witness. Inside the diner, Wayne Becker was restocking napkin holders, his mind still replaying the events of the previous day. He'd fired Clara without a second thought, convinced he'd done the right thing. Rules were rules, after all, but a nagging unease had settled in his gut, a flicker of doubt he couldn't shake. The bell above the door jingled, and Wayne looked up, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. It nearly slipped from his grasp when he saw the officer standing in the doorway, tall, imposing, his eyes hard and unyielding. "I'd like to speak to the owner," the man said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made Wayne's stomach lurch. Wayne stepped forward, his face draining of color. I'm the owner," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, the crowd had grown, drawn by whispers and the glow of camera phones capturing the scene. The air crackled with curiosity and awe. Colonel Turner removed his cap, holding it respectfully at his side. "My name is Colonel Matthew Turner," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Son of Eli Turner." The name landed like a thunderclap. Wayne's mouth fell open, but no sound came. His mind raced, piecing together fragments. Eli, the homeless man he'd shooed away countless times. Clara, the waitress he had fired for feeding him. And now this officer standing before him, commanding the respect of an entire military procession. The weight of his actions crashed over him, and for the first time, Wayne felt the full measure of his shame. Colonel Marcus Turner stood at the counter of the diner, his voice steady as a metronome, yet imbued with an authority that silenced the room. His eyes, weathered by years of service, bore into Wayne Becker, the manager who had unleashed his scorn on a disheveled man the day before. That man, now the subject of Turner's measured words, was no ordinary vagrant. "The person you publicly shamed here yesterday," Turner said, his tone unwavering but laced with a quiet intensity, "is the reason I'm standing here today." The air in the diner grew heavy as if the walls themselves held their breath. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen ceased, and every patron turned, caught in the gravity of the moment. Turner's mind drifted back to 2007, to the scorching sands of Iraq during his third deployment. His convoy had been ambushed, a chaotic blur of gunfire and explosions. His transport took a direct hit, leaving him and 11 others pinned down, their lives hanging by a thread. Amid the chaos, one man, a soldier with shrapnel embedded in his leg, had refused to falter. That soldier, Michael Rutherford, had carried Turner 3 grueling miles through enemy territory, his own pain a distant second to the mission of saving his comrade. "He wouldn't accept treatment until every last one of us was safe," Turner said, his voice catching ever so slightly, betraying the stoic facade. From his coat pocket, he produced a laminated citation, its edges worn but the words still bold, a silver star awarded to Rutherford for his valor. The room remained still, the weight of the revelation settling over everyone like dust after a storm. Wayne Becker stood frozen behind the counter, his face a mask of panic and shame. His eyes darted frantically, searching the faces of the diner's patrons for an ally, a defender, anyone to break the suffocating silence. But no one moved. No one spoke. The truth was too heavy, too undeniable. Turner's gaze softened as he continued, his voice now tinged with a sorrow he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Michael refused help for years," he said. "After my mother passed, his PTSD took hold, dragging him into a darkness none of us could pull him from. He vanished." Turner's jaw tightened, the memory of those desperate months of searching for his friend cutting deeper than he'd expected. "We looked everywhere, and now," he said, stepping closer to the counter, his boots echoing on the worn linoleum, "we find him here, not saved by the system, not by this town, but by a waitress, the one you fired." Outside, a crowd had gathered, their murmurs rising like a tide. Phones were out, capturing every word, every gesture, hashtags already sparking across social media. Turner's voice found a steadier rhythm now, as if drawing strength from the story he was telling. "Michael Rutherford earned medals most will only ever dream of," he said, his eyes never leaving Wayne. "But he told me once medals don't feed the hungry, so he pawned his silver star, his badge of honor, to buy food for a homeless family." Turner paused, letting the words sink in, his chest tight with pride and grief. "And that waitress you fired, she reminded me of the America Michael thought he'd lost, a country worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for." At that moment, a young corporal stepped through the diner's glass door, his uniform crisp despite the weight of the small black case he carried. Inside lay the very silver star Michael had pawned, retrieved now as a symbol of his sacrifice. Turner's eyes flicked to the door. "Bring her here," he said, his voice firm, but carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Across town, Clara James was in her small rented room above a garage, the walls thin and the air heavy with the scent of motor oil. She was still reeling from the events of the previous day, her firing, the humiliation, the way she'd stood up for the man everyone else had ignored. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found a local reporter, her face flushed with excitement, a camera crew hovering behind her. "They're asking for you," the reporter said, breathless. "The soldiers, Colonel Turner, they've shut down the whole block. You have to come now." Clara's heart raced, her mind struggling to process the words. Was this a dream? But as she stepped outside, the reality hit her. The crowd, the uniforms, the salutes. It was all too real. As she approached the diner, the line of soldiers parted slightly, their faces solemn yet reverent. Then, in a single unified motion, 200 soldiers raised their right hands to their foreheads, saluting her, a waitress, a nobody in the eyes of the world. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't name. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. The silence was deafening, profound, saying more than words ever could. Colonel Turner stepped forward, the silver star gleaming in his hand. "My father wanted you to have this," he said, his voice soft but resolute. Clara shook her head, trembling, her hands instinctively pulling back. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not mine." But Turner, with a gentleness that belied his years of command, placed the medal in her palm. "It is now," he said, and in that moment, Clara felt the weight of not just the medal, but the story it carried, the sacrifice, the loss, the quiet heroism. The fallout was swift and merciless. The diner closed its doors the next day, its reputation shattered. Suppliers canceled their contracts, staff walked away, and veterans groups picketed the entrance. Their signs a silent rebuke of Wayne Becker's actions. Wayne himself vanished from town within weeks, leaving behind a legacy of shame he couldn't outrun. But Clara didn't revel in his downfall. She didn't seek the spotlight, didn't post triumphant updates, or give interviews. Instead, she returned to what she knew best, serving others with a quiet, unshakable strength. Her life, though, was no longer the same. A veteran nonprofit, moved by her compassion, offered her a full-time role managing a new community kitchen. The soldiers she'd met that day at the diner returned, not as patrons but as volunteers, their hands ready to serve alongside hers. The line outside the kitchen grew longer each day, but so did the warmth within its walls. In the corner of her small office sat a wooden box, simple but sacred. Inside rested a folded American flag, the silver star, and a single tarnished dog tag, Michael's, that Clara carried in her pocket, a quiet reminder of the man who'd changed everything. Justice didn't come quickly. It never does. It moved slowly, like the first rays of morning light creeping across a windowsill, steady and unstoppable. The diner where Clara had once worked stood empty now, its open 24 hours neon sign dark, its windows clouded with dust. But in its place, something new had taken root, a community built on compassion, on the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. The faded "For Lease" sign fluttered behind the grimy window of the old diner, a relic of better days when the place buzzed with life. Truckers with grease-stained caps, locals nursing coffee, and wide-eyed tourists passing through had once filled its booths, their chatter mingling with the clink of silverware. But that morning, the one etched into the town's memory as the day the soldiers came, changed everything. The diner's doors never opened again, its warmth snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Across town, though, something new was stirring, something alive and brimming with hope. In a crumbling warehouse that had long housed nothing but dusty, broken vending machines, lights now burned late into the night. The air carried the rich, comforting scent of chili-dusted cornbread and freshly brewed coffee, weaving through the halls alongside bursts of laughter that echoed like a promise of better days. Clara stood at the center of this transformation, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and disbelief. The Ridgefield Community Kitchen, born from the vision of a veteran-founded nonprofit, had become her unlikely home. Just a week after the incident that turned her quiet life upside down, they'd offered her the role of manager. She hadn't sought it out, hadn't even dreamed of it. Clara was never one for the spotlight. She preferred the shadows, where she could work unnoticed, her hands busy and her heart full. But people like Colonel Eli Turner, with his weathered face and unyielding sense of duty, had made sure her story reached far beyond the town's borders. Not for fame or fleeting applause, but to hold up a mirror to a nation that too often forgot what true courage looked like. To them, Clara wasn't just a name. She was a reminder that bravery often wore a quiet face, one that didn't demand recognition, but earned it all the same. On paper, Clara was the kitchen's manager, responsible for schedules, supplies, and keeping the chaos at bay. In truth, the role felt less like a bum and more like tending to a sprawling, messy, beautiful family. The kitchen hummed with unlikely allies, grizzled former soldiers peeling potatoes with the same precision they once applied to their rifles, single mothers stirring pots with a quiet strength born of survival, high school volunteers ladling steaming soup with eager hands, and retired nurses wiping down tables with a care that spoke of decades spent healing. Smokey, the one-eyed tabby cat who'd wandered in one rainy afternoon and never left, presided over it all from his perch on the windowsill. His single golden eye surveyed the room like a battle-scarred general, his soft purrs a gentle counterpoint to the clatter of pots and pans. To Clara, Smokey was more than a mascot. He was a kindred spirit, a creature who'd seen hardship and chosen to stay. His quiet presence a comfort on the hardest days. Clara's heart still raced when she thought of the moment that had changed everything, not just for her, but for the entire town. It had been a week since the salute, that raw, powerful gesture from 200 soldiers that had rippled across the country, captured in a grainy video that spread faster than Clara could have imagined. She hadn't expected it, hadn't wanted it. She'd only done what felt right, standing up when others might have looked away, her voice steady despite the fear that had churned in her chest. That act of defiance, born of love and loyalty, had sparked something bigger than herself. Now, as she moved through the kitchen, her apron dusted with a flour and her hands calloused from work, she carried that moment with her, not as a badge of pride, but as a quiet reminder of why she was here. The most unforgettable moment came one late afternoon, just past 4 p.m., when the kitchen was winding down. The clatter of dishes had softened, and the volunteers were wiping down counters, their chatter a low hum. The door creaked open, and a small boy stepped inside, no older than 7 or 8. His sandy hair stuck out in all directions, and his oversized sneakers scuffed the floor as he walked. His face was serious, almost solemn, as if he carried a weight far too heavy for his small frame. In one hand, he clutched a dollar bill, folded with care into precise thirds, as if the act of folding it had been a ritual in itself. In the other, he held a cookie wrapped in wax paper, tied with a piece of twine that looked like it had been knotted with painstaking effort. He marched straight to the counter where Clara stood, his eyes locking onto hers with a determination that made her breath catch. "I saw you in the video," he said, his voice small but steady, cutting through the quiet. "My grandpa was a soldier too. He used to help people all the time. I want to help someone too." He placed the cookie and the dollar on the counter, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze unwavering. Clara knelt down, her knees pressing into the worn linoleum, her hands resting on her thighs as she fought the tears welling in her eyes. She could see it in his face. The pride, the loss, the quiet resolve to honor someone he loved. "Can I use this to help someone else?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, as if he feared she might say no. For a long moment, Clara couldn't speak. Her throat tightened and her heart ached with a mix of gratitude and awe. She thought of her own grandfather, his words echoing in her mind. Honor isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, like a heartbeat. She placed her hand over her heart, mirroring the salute those 200 soldiers had given her days before, and gave the boy a slow, deliberate nod. No words were needed, no grand gestures required. In that small exchange, a single act of kindness stretched forward, a thread connecting past to present, one heart to another. Across town, Eli Turner, the veteran whose courage had set this all in motion, had found a measure of peace. He now had a roof over his head at a nearby VA housing unit, a place where the walls were plain, but the care was steady. His son visited often, their conversations filled with the easy rhythm of family rediscovered. Younger soldiers came too, drawn by Eli's stories, not just the ones about wars fought in distant lands, but the quieter battles waged right here at home. Stories of loss, of resilience, of finding purpose in the wreckage. Clara visited when she could, slipping away from the kitchen's demands to sit with him. They didn't need many words. She still carried his dog tag, its weight a constant in her pocket, and kept his silver star in a simple wooden box by her bedside. Some nights, when the world felt too heavy, she'd trace her fingers over its edges, whispering her grandfather's words like a prayer. Honor isn't something loud. It's quiet. Time would move on, as it always did. The headlines would fade, the video would slip down the endless scroll of yesterday's news, buried beneath the next outrage or fleeting trend. But for those who had witnessed it, who had truly seen Clara's courage, the memory would linger. Not because she'd stood up, but because she'd done so when it was hardest, when fear could have silenced her. Because she gave without expecting a single thing in return. Because in a world that too often overlooked its quiet heroes, Clara's actions shone like a beacon, reminding everyone what dignity looked like when no one was watching. In a world that rushed forward, always chasing the next big thing, she was a testament to the power of quiet moments. The ones that, if you paused long enough to notice, could change everything. In a small, weathered town where the hum of daily life often drowned out the quiet struggles of its people, Clara James moved through her days with a steady grace that few noticed. She was a waitress at a modest diner on the edge of Main Street, her apron stained with coffee and ketchup, her hands calloused from years of balancing trays and wiping down counters. Clara didn't carry the weight of the world in loud proclamations. She didn't join the marches that swept through the town square, nor did she add her voice to the chorus of online posts that lit up screens with fervor. Her heart, though, burned with a different kind of conviction, one that didn't need a megaphone to make itself known. On a chilly autumn evening, when the diner's neon sign flickered weakly against the dusk, a man shuffled through the door. He was a veteran, his coat threadbare, his face etched with lines that told stories of battles fought and burdens carried. To most, he was invisible, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a society too busy to pause. The other patrons barely glanced his way, their conversations humming over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. But Clara saw him, not just his tattered clothes or the slump of his shoulders, but the weight of a life that had been discarded by a world that moved on without him. Her heart ached, not with pity, but with a fierce resolve to offer something more than the indifference he'd grown accustomed to. She approached him with a smile that held no judgment, only warmth. "Evening," she said softly, her voice steady as she gestured to a booth by the window. "You look like you could use something warm." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mix of wariness and exhaustion, as if kindness was a language he'd forgotten. Clara didn't push, she simply waited, her presence a quiet promise that he wasn't invisible to her. When he finally nodded and slid into the seat, she brought him a steaming plate of pot roast, a side of green beans, and a mug of coffee that curled tendrils of warmth into the air. She didn't ask for his story, didn't demand explanations for the dirt under his nails or the tremor in his hands. She gave him something far more precious, a moment of dignity, a fleeting chance to feel human again. Clara's act was small, unremarkable in the grand tapestry of the world's noise. Yet, in that quiet diner, it rippled outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. A regular at the counter, a gruff mechanic named Tom, noticed the exchange. He'd seen the veteran around town before, always keeping his distance, but something about Clara's gesture stirred him. He felt a pang of guilt for all the times he'd looked away, too caught up in his own worries to acknowledge the man's existence. Across the room, a young mother juggling her toddler and a stack of bills watched Clara's quiet kindness and felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought of her own father, estranged and struggling, and wondered if anyone had ever offered him such grace. Even the cook, peering through the pass-through window, paused mid-flip of a burger, his usual grumbling silenced by the weight of what he'd witnessed. Word of Clara's gesture spread, not through hashtags or viral videos, but through whispers over coffee cups and conversations at the grocery store. The town, so often divided by politics and pride, found itself stirred by a single act of compassion. People began to talk not about grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but about the power of seeing someone, truly seeing them when no one else did. Clara didn't seek the attention. She went back to her shifts, pouring coffee and scrubbing tables, her heart steady but heavy with the knowledge that one plate of food couldn't fix a broken world. Still, she carried on, because to her, kindness wasn't about fixing everything. It was about doing what she could, where she was, with what she had. This story isn't just about Clara or the veteran she fed. It's about the choices we all make in the moments when no one's watching, when the world isn't waiting to applaud. It's about the grocery store clerk we rush past, the neighbor we avoid because their grief feels too heavy, the family member we've stopped trying to understand. In a country where loneliness creeps like a feet and respect feels like a fading memory, Clara's quiet act reminds us that honor doesn't always come with a medal or a spotlight. Sometimes it's in the soft clink of a coffee mug set down with care, the warmth of a meal offered without expectation, the courage to look someone in the eye and say, "You matter." Her story challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How many people have we overlooked in our hurry to get through the day? How often have we let fear of judgment or the weight of our own struggles drown out the call to be kind? Clara's choice wasn't easy. It cost her time, energy, and the vulnerability of reaching out when she could have looked away. But it was enough to shake a town, to remind its people that compassion doesn't need a stage to make a difference. In a world that often feels fractured, her story is a quiet call to action, a reminder that the smallest gestures can carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words.